Hey, welcome to Black Rock. My name is Dan and I'm on staff here. Before the sermon starts, I want to take a second to invite you to join us in person if you're able. If you have any questions about visiting or about our church in general, feel free to check out blackrock.org/visit or email me at guests@blackrock.org. Now, here's the sermon.
Well, good morning, Black Rock. For those who don't know, my name is Paul Huebner, and I have the privilege of serving our middle schoolers here at this church as their pastor. Thanks. I made a shocking discovery recently. I learned that this year, for the first time, I'm going to be serving exclusively Generation Alpha at Thrive. What that means, it blew my mind when I first heard that. What that means is that everyone in this room, if you have made it through middle school, there is at least one generation that is below you. With the majority in this room having at least one generation below us, we naturally have some sort of influence over them. But Paul, the teenager in my life, never listens to me. I didn't say they listen to everything that comes out of your mouth. I said you have influence on them. And whether you're in a previous generation belonging to the greatest generation, if you're a boomer, if you're a Gen X, millennial, Gen Z, one of the most important realms of influence you can have on future generations is how they worship. The Bible gives a case study for us of this in 2 Chronicles, and we're going to take a snapshot from that today. That we get to see the pattern of how generations that went before have an impact on the generations that follow. When we read the Old Testament, we quickly learn that God's chosen people is Israel. Israel's greatest leader of all time is King David. While he's not the perfect man, David loved the Lord his God, so much so that 1 Samuel 13:14 calls him a man after God's own heart. How do we know that's true? Well, one of David's biggest goals in life was to build a temple to worship God in Jerusalem. Previously, God would dwell in a tent, a tabernacle, and they'd move it from place to place as they went. But David said, no, that's not good enough for God. I want to have a permanent, grand building that everybody can come to and worship the Lord. When he consulted God about it, God told David that actually he wouldn't build it, but Solomon, his son, would. At this point, I think it would have been perfectly acceptable for David to wash his hands of the whole project. He's not getting credit for building that. Solomon was. But David tenaciously sticks with the idea of making sure that God is worshiped properly. 1 Chronicles 22 tells us that David makes extensive preparations before his death. He gathers gold, stone, precious materials. He locates and hires stonemasons and carpenters. He hands Solomon the drafts for the plans that have everything from the inner rooms to the upper heights of the temple. He breaks it down into articles and says, every little piece of things that's going to belong in this temple, I'm going to measure it down to you by the weight. He incredibly thinks through this entire thing. Honestly, David is the dream group project partner. He just basically hands Solomon everything, and all Solomon has to do is say, all right, men, let's get to work. David was so excited to build the temple because in his heart, he had such a priority to worship God. He could have done a lot of things in the last years of his life. He could have cemented his military legacy. He could have worked on economic reform, but he prioritized the worship of God rather than deciding to pursue other aims. So if we move down 2 generations of kings from David, Solomon's son Rehoboam starts his reign in 1 Kings 12. During his time as king, there's a civil war in Israel. The nation splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is Israel, the southern kingdom is Judah. Rehoboam maintains control of the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam takes control over the northern kingdom. The temple that Solomon built is in Rehoboam's territory down south in Jerusalem. Even though Jeroboam has more territory, Jeroboam sees this as a problem. Jeroboam starts worrying and saying, what if people go down to Jerusalem to worship at this temple and they never come back? What if they decide, well, we want to be close to where we can worship God, so we're never going to end up going back to his kingdom. He's going to hemorrhage all of his citizens. So Jeroboam comes up with a new plan to prevent that from happening. He sets up 2 golden calves on either side of his kingdom for people to worship. He tells the people, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Why golden calves? Well, scholars think that the 2 golden calves found here were borrowed from pagan culture around the Israelites. Let's put it this way. These golden calves were basically the great value version of the Egyptian god Apis. Jeroboam sees that his security is under threat, and his solution is to find a convenient place for his people to worship false gods. And worship false gods they do, from generation to generation of Israel's kings that follow. Why do I bring up this history lesson? Because David and Jeroboam both have a profound impact on the generations that follow them. In fact, the chronicler uses them essentially as a metric to define most of the future generations of kings. The subsequent kings, they almost get a rating based on how they measure up to those previous generations. We're going to walk through some of these today, but to hammer home that point, the main idea I want to leave you with is that earlier generations' decision to prioritize worshiping God influences future generations. The decision that generations that are older, when they make, they say, yes, I want to go worship the Lord. I want to worship the Lord with my heart, with my actions, with what I sacrifice. That has an impact on future generations that follow. Let's start with King Uzziah. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Pastor Dan preached on it back on August 4th, and he did a phenomenal job of breaking down his life. So instead of recapping, I'm just going to summarize. 2 Chronicles 26:4 says, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all his father Amaziah had done. Notice right there, first example, there's the generational legacy piece. Where did Uzziah learn to do what was right in the eyes of the Lord? It was through the example of his father, Amaziah. Unfortunately, though, as you saw last month, Uzziah doesn't stay there, because when he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. On a scale of David to Jeroboam, I would place him somewhere in the middle. He started off great, didn't end too well. And I've made a chart here to help keep track of all these kings. The ones that are in green, they follow the legacy of David. The ones that are in red have followed the legacy of the kings of Israel and of Jeroboam. After Uzziah comes Jotham. And here's how the chronicler labels Jotham in 2 Chronicles 27:2. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done, except he did not enter into the temple of the Lord. Okay, looks promising, but that's how Uzziah started out too, right? Uzziah followed the good model of his father, but he failed. So I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it doesn't. Jotham's reign is described in verse 6. Jotham grew powerful because he walked steadfastly before the Lord his God. I don't think that was a happy accident. I think there's a key player in Jotham's story that prevented him from falling off the deep end like Uzziah, his father. The clue is found in Jotham's introduction in 2 Chronicles 27:1. Jotham was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. His mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. Did you catch it? My radar went up when I read that passage. I'm gonna ask you guys a question. How many of you in this room have ever read anything in 1 Chronicles before? You can raise your hand. And that's okay if you haven't, because here's why. It's usually not in people's top 10 favorite books of the Bible to read. Because 1 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9 is full of genealogies. Let me give you a sample from chapter 8. Benjamin was the father of Bela, his firstborn, Ashbel, his second son, Ahariah the third, Noah the fourth, and Rapha the fifth. The sons of Bela were Adar, Gerar, Abihud. I'll stop there. It's 9 chapters of basically just that. Name after name after name. We don't actually get into the story until chapter 10 in 1 Chronicles. Most normal, sane people would skip right to chapter 10 and start from there because they don't need to know that Abihud was the son of Bela. But since I've made the voluntary decision to work with middle schoolers year after year, it's fair to say that my sanity has been called into question a few times. Here's why I don't skip 1 Chronicles 1 through 9. The chronicler has a habit of listing out male descendants in genealogies. That's what its culture is concerned with. Who's your father and who's his father? What is your line, your heritage that you come from? But whenever the chronicler mentions a woman, it's always for a particular reason. For example, Shirah, the daughter of Ephraim, built 3 cities by herself. That's an incredible task. So when I see the chronicler mention males, he mentions them out of obligation. When he mentions a woman, that makes my radar go up. He isn't just throwing that name around for nothing. That name must be there for some important reason. In this case, Jerusha was Jotham's mother. She was also the daughter of Zadok. Zadok was the leader of the priests who served before the tabernacle of the Lord. Who was he appointed by? King David himself. Zadok helped David organize the priests who were going to minister in that future temple. And Zadok helped David execute his vision of worshiping the Lord. Zadok's daughter raised King Jotham. She must have been an incredible influence on King Jotham. In fact, I think she was the only reason that Jotham turned toward the Lord. Without her influence, Jotham probably would have succumbed to the fate of King Uzziah, just being mediocre at best. Jotham's mother reached down a generation and helped break the trend from mediocre to great. Jotham's mother reaches down a generation and she models what prioritizing the worship of God looks like. My mother did the same thing for me, whether she realized it or not. When I first started going to high school, I was forced to get up before the sun did. My high schoolers can relate. I remember the first time I got up that early, I was shocked to find that my mom was already sitting on the couch. My 14-year-old brain was scrambling to figure out why would somebody get up that early until I saw what she was doing. My mom was reading her Bible, the same Bible that she received when she first started following Jesus back in college. Not wanting to interrupt, I went about my morning, I left for school. I found her in the same spot the next morning, then Wednesday morning, and every morning after that for the rest of my high school career. My mom didn't just tell me that reading the Bible was important. I consistently saw the first fruits of my mom's time being given in worship to the Lord as she dug into God's word. I honestly believe that one of the reasons why I have such a high value for scripture is because my mom taught me the value of prioritizing it with her example. Let's briefly go over the ratings of some of the following kings, and we'll stop at the next point of interest. Next is King Ahaz. Here's what the chronicler has to say. He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord as his father David had done, but he walked in the ways of the king of Israel. So we see a turn for the worse with Ahaz. He follows after Jeroboam, the kings of Israel example. Hezekiah comes next, and Hezekiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord according to all that David, his father, had done. Followed by Manasseh. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And lastly, we'll talk about Ammon. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord as Manasseh, his father, had done. Ammon sacrificed to all the images Manasseh, his father, had made, and he served them. Man, those 4 descriptions are chock full of generational impact, whether they're referencing David or the direct father of that person. Let's zoom in on King Josiah, the next king. Here's what the chronicler has to say about him. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he walked in the ways of David, his father. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. Josiah should be a name that sounds vaguely familiar. Pastor Russ mentioned him on August 18th. There's a reason why Josiah upsets the downward trend of the 2 previous wicked kings before him. That reason has a name, and the name is Huldah. As Russ just stated a few weeks ago, Huldah interpreted the words of law for King Josiah. Her interpretation caused Josiah to understand how to worship God and brought about a nationwide revival, drawing hearts of the people of Israel back to their God. I believe that making a priority of worshiping God still has influence even without a family tie. Huldah had no relation whatsoever to King Josiah, but she still makes an impact on him, so much so that she changes the trajectory of him and a whole generation. I think there's a special influence that happens with family, but there can be generational influence that happens even if there's no blood relation involved. Hazel Dugan is the example of that in my life. Hazel taught middle school Sunday school at the church I grew up in. She also ran the middle school vacation Bible school at the church had as well. Hazel taught me a lot, but I have a specific memory that greatly impacted me. Not only was Hazel a teacher, but she also happened to be our family's babysitter. One of the few brave souls that babysat the 5 of us at the same time that were born. As they would say down south, bless her heart. I love metaphors, and I always have, even when I was a kid. And I would tell Hazel about these metaphors that I would think of to explain these deep concepts of God I was thinking about. And as I'm sure 8-year-old Paul was just blathering on to her about this metaphor, about something to do with a lighthouse and how that relates to God, she looked at me, she listened intently, and she looked at me and she said, Paul, you have an amazing mind. I think you're going to be a pastor someday. 8-year-old Paul shrugged off that comment and went over to snacks. 30-year-old Paul treasured that comment in his heart the day he got ordained here at Black Rock Church. Hazel modeled what it was to explain God's word to middle schoolers, something that I've been doing for the past 7 years of my life in different churches. Hazel also showed me how to empower and to encourage others with tools I use in my ministry today. Now, this last chunk of rulers that we have are pretty grim looking. Jehoahaz's reign lasts 3 months before he loses his throne to the king of Egypt. Jehoiakim loses his kingdom to the king of Babylon. Jehoiachim rules for 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar summons him to Babylon and replaces him. King Zedekiah tries to rebel against the king of Babylon, and he miserably fails, with the result being the people of Judah are slaughtered or taken into captivity, and God's temple is burned to the ground. Those last 3 kings are all described as this same stock phrase: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This all happened over the span of less than 23 years, just a bit more than how we would define our average generation today. It would be easy to point at that time frame, at that snapshot in history, and say, there's no hope, they've hit rock bottom. It would be easy for previous generations of Israelites to fold their arms, click their tongues at the moral decay of their youngsters. Oh, they're ruining our country. We never would have let this happen if we were in charge. But that sentiment is live and well, whether it's 700 BC or the 21st century. It's easy to turn on the news, read through Facebook stories, or scroll through TikTok and see story after story which makes us lose hope in our future. We can point the finger at hours upon hours of video game addiction that young men have, or crippling anxiety and depression that our young women have from playing social media comparison games. The easy route to go is to throw up our hands and say, the world's irreparable and the younger generation better get their acts together. One reaction I typically get from people when I tell them I work with middle schoolers is, God bless you, I certainly could not do that. And then that sentiment, the underlying premise, is that middle schoolers are too far gone, they're too crazy, too irrational, too beyond hope to work with. Well, those kings in Israel, while historically they appear to be the end of the story, they are in fact not. Why? The line of King David does not end with Zedekiah, it ends with Jesus, the King of Judah. The enemy does not have the last say in our future generations, Jesus does. Through his humble death on the cross, Jesus breaks the power of sin and death that can have such a stronghold on us no matter what generation we belong to. Psalm 22 sings prophetically of Jesus when it declares, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. It's not Satan that has dominion, it's the Lord. It's not addiction that has dominion, it's the Lord. It's not wars or rumors of wars that have dominion, it's the Lord. It's not violence that has dominion, it is the Lord. It is not whatever your fill-in-the-blank pet topic about our younger generation's problem that rules at the end of the day, it is the Lord. And the Lord has ultimate dominion over this world. That we can have hope for breakthrough in each and every generation because of the mighty redemptive work of our King. I know this because of my own family legacy. Walter Huebner moved to the United States when he was a young boy. Walter grew up in a home where God was a fairy tale designed for ignorant fools. His father was a militant atheist, hardened by the hardships of the past, of post-World War I Germany. Walter had a handful of kids, and one of them named Tom Huebner, my dad. Tom went to Milford High School, where he found himself in detention one day. Bored, Tom paced the room until he caught something with his eye. He picked up a small tract off the windowsill of a classroom and took a few minutes to read through it because he had nothing better to do. After reading it, the Holy Spirit got a hold of my dad's heart, and he started to follow Jesus and start going to a local church. At first, his family thought he was crazy, but one by one, Tom slowly converted each of his siblings until one day, Walter changed his mind about God. My grandfather, Walter, did not just slightly change his mind, he became an ordained minister in 1995. If any Christian looked at the Huebner household fresh off the boat from Germany, they would have declared, there is no hope here. The combination of proud intellectualism and hardship made for incredibly tough soil. And I stand here today because someone put a tract in my father Tom's path. Someone followed the prompting of the Holy Spirit and obediently left a copy of the gospel in a room where it changed the entire trajectory of my forefathers and permeated my heart here today. No matter how hopeless the enemy tries to paint the picture of the future, the power of Christ can break through and turn the hearts of each generation back to the Lord our God. So the question I want to leave you with today is this: will you model for future generations how to make the worship of God a priority? Just like King David did. David has a generational legacy because he desired to follow and worship the Lord. That's what we want to be known by. I would love for other people to say, yeah, my son follows Jesus like the way that you follow him. What an incredible privilege to be able to do that. Sometimes that means we make sacrifices. Sometimes that means we show up to church when it's raining outside and we forgot our kid's rain jacket and we're saying, why don't I just stay at home? Maybe sometimes that involves we're in a difficult family situation and we can't even focus on anything, let alone going to church. But we make that decision to go to church and worship the Lord our God because that's our priority. When our student ministry thought about that question, will you model for future generations how to make the worship of God a priority? One of our BlackRock families came to mind. Here's their story, and it shows they made the decision to start coming here at BlackRock and some of the ripple effects that came out of that decision as a result.
My family and I started to come to BlackRock after COVID, and Gavin and I started to attend Fusion, and we became part of the student leadership team. And we got an opportunity to go on Lead Week, which was a discipleship training event. And we were there for that weekend, and Kevin pulled me and Gavin aside and told us that my mom was on the phone, and she then informed us that my grandmother passed away in a tragic car accident. All that was running through my mind was like, this isn't happening. Sorry. So yeah, my heart just broke, and there's no other way that like I can put it.
Colleen called and shared that her mom had passed away in a tragic car accident. It was one of those calls you never want to get. Instantly, your heart just begins to break for this whole family. As we shared the news with Gavin and Hannah, we saw grief just pour all over them. Then our adult leaders and our students just began to rally around them and immediately just began praying for them. Liv Leonard, one of our adult leaders, and I, we loaded in the car and drove Gavin and Hannah all the way back home. To see them care for each other on the drive home and then watch them just collapse in the arms of their mom and dad was both heart-wrenching, and yet it was an honor to be with a family and to try to support them as best we could. Really, we just wanted to be like Jesus to them in that moment, to love them, to pray for them, hug them, and try to serve them any way we could. The kids were part of our ministry for a few years, but in that moment, it really wasn't a ministry, it was a family. a kingdom family. And that's really what we're called to be.
In my quiet time in the morning, God sent me that song by Lauren Daigle, and it's Rescue, and it talks about God sending you an army in your darkest days. And at that time, I didn't realize that my army was here at Black Rock Church.
Yeah, and it was, I kind of came through a fog. I even realized that we had to tell the kids, and they were already halfway home. Kevin and Liv were bringing them. There was no even hesitation. And when Kevin and Liv came into the house, and prayed with us, and Liv led the prayer. I was just so impressed that, such a young girl, early 20s, was able to come into our darkest moment and just pray with us. And I could really see that something was different with, the student ministry at Black Rock.
During the next year, we watched the student ministry team just love on Gavin and Hannah, give them the strength on really the hard days and just push through.
And watching the way that the leaders and the leadership at Fusion came alongside the kids, I could tell something was different, but it took me a while to figure out what it was. And what it was is that they followed Jesus and they genuinely loved God. And through that, I just watched how my kids were blessed and the church is blessed.
And because of those moments, it's when we felt God calling us to be part of the student ministry team.
I feel like through the entire thing, Fusion had well supported me in the trials, and that just continued to show me what it looks like to create safe spaces and honor your students. And just as God showed me my call to ministry, I ended up interning here because of moments like this, where they showed me what good God-honoring ministry looks like.
Right now, it is unbelievably difficult to be a young person in our culture and in our world. Gavin and Hannah had a level of support because they'd been part of our student ministry and they had built some connections with our kids and our adult leaders. The truth is, all kids are facing difficulties, and we all need a kingdom family. The purpose of our student ministry is to help them in their journey, to have a deep relationship with God, and to have a community, to have real and lasting friendships, to support them, to love them, and to care for them, all of them. We want kids to connect with our adult leaders, to be encouraged, to be spiritually mentored, to be taught how to follow Jesus in their everyday lives. We want to see our kids become passionate and resilient followers of Jesus. We want you to be a part of that. We invite you to be a part of that. Pray for them, support them, get involved in serving them, show them Jesus' love, his truth, and be the kingdom family that this generation is longing for.
Thanks for tuning into our sermon here at Black Rock. I'm so glad you found us, and I hope and pray this message helped you get more connected to Jesus. Speaking of connection, if you're interested in taking your next steps towards getting connected at Black Rock, use the quick links in the description below. There you'll find links for information if you're new, for upcoming events, online giving, and more. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our podcast so you can stay up to date with every single thing we post. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week, either online or in person.